in 1996, he decides to make an album again with Glenn Hughes. And once again, this was supposed to be a Tony Iommi solo album. And they recorded a bunch of things, and it was ended up being called the DEP Sessions. And what happened was, long before it was put out as the DEP Sessions, there was a bootleg. And I had the bootleg, and some people I knew had the bootleg. And it was like an album's worth of material written by him and Glenn. And it's kind of the two of them together is a really interesting mix, because Glenn Hughes, for all of his pipes and his vocal prowess, is a soul singer. He's not a blues singer, and he's not a metal singer. Now, he can shriek with the best of them, and he can do Highway Star and all of that stuff. He can sing anything you ever care to sing. But at his heart, he is like, his vocal style comes from the Stevie Wonder school. He's not like, it worked wonderfully with when you were blending it with David Coverdale. But I mean, he's a soul singer more than a rock singer or a metal singer, and he brings the funk. So you had this album that they put out together called the DEP Sessions, and they put it out eventually because everybody seemed to have copies of the bootleg, and they finally decided to put it out. Let me look it up while we're talking about it.
It's kind of an interesting way to put out an album.
Yeah, so it was a bootleg. It was called Eighth Star because the last one had been called Seventh Star. So someone had the bright idea to call it Eighth Star. And so they put this out, and it's a really interesting album in that the two of them blend very well. And for most people who work with Glenn Hughes, if you're not a good songwriter, or if you're not a strong songwriter, if you're just an average guy, Glenn Hughes tends to bowl you over because he's a good songwriter. And he's a bass player. He mostly writes on bass, and he writes a lot of funk bass stuff that's like where the riff is like bass riffs rather than guitar riffs. And it's an interesting sort of place that he comes from. And you wouldn't think that he's going to like mate particularly musically well with the father of heavy metal and riffs, right? But for whatever reason, when they get together, it's very interesting music. And they did this album, and it got shelved. It never saw the light of day when they originally recorded it. And I think they originally recorded it. I don't know when they originally recorded it, but
96.
Yeah, it looks like it was 96, but it didn't come out in 96 unless you had the bootleg.
Yeah, it came out in 2004, and then they recorded the drums. What was the reason why they didn't put it out?
I think, again, it was supposed to be a Tony Iommi solo album, and then it didn't happen as a solo album, and I don't think Glenn Hughes wanted to get roped into doing Sabbath again, and I think he had that happen. And the reason they redid the drums seriously was because the original drum tracks were performed by Dave Holland, who had been the Judas Priest drummer, and he got convicted of I guess they called it attempted rape several years later, but it was with young boys, and they didn't want any association with Dave Holland, so they took the original tracks and they brought in I guess it was Jimmy Copley, I guess they brought in, and Don Airey on keyboards, and Jeff Nichols occasionally on keyboards. And like I said, this is an interesting album. It's, in my opinion, it's 8 songs. It's better, in my opinion, than the stuff they came up with on Seventh Star. But these two would reunite again in 2005 and come up with really a fantastic album. But Glenn Hughes brings a very powerful voice with him, but he also brings some soul that you're not really used to hearing when you hear IOMMI. It's definitely a different. It's, for a lack of term, it's less white. It's really just, he brings some soul to this that Even guys like Dio have plenty of soul in his voice. Dio's not a soul singer.
He's definitely a unique singer in this rock landscape in terms of style.
Yeah, and it's funny. He's another guy who's sort of a polarizing figure because you either love his voice or you don't. And
what's not to like about it?
People who only have experience with like singers that come from the blues side may not like it. If you don't like R&B and soul and things that are like Stevie Wonder kinds of vocals, if you don't like that in heavy rock and metal, it can be off-putting.
Right.
And there are times where it works, and there are times where it doesn't work quite as well. But oddly enough, when he works with Tony balances him out in a way that like lesser players don't. When he worked with Blackmore, he was great. When he worked with IOMMI, he was great. When he works with good songwriters, he's great. And when he works with guys who are just average guys, it tends to be the Glenn Hughes band. Whether you like it or not, he becomes the primary songwriting vehicle of those bands. Mm-hmm. This is what we talked about with Joe Bonamassa when he was doing Black Country Communion with Joe Bonamassa. Joe Bonamassa can't write rock riffs. So this band, Black Country Communion, it's basically Glenn Hughes driving the songwriting and Joe Bonamassa playing lead over it. So fast forward, and now he's working with Doug Aldrich. Doug's a better songwriter. Doug writes, Doug can hold his own with Glenn Hughes. And it doesn't sound like a Glenn Hughes album. And I say this as someone who owns a lot of Glenn Hughes albums and likes them, but it's like when you hear him with guys who are not particularly strong songwriters, they tend to get bowled over.
Right.
It's like, imagine yourself, I mean, this is an extreme example, but imagine yourself working with Paul McCartney and you're not a good songwriter. What's the music going to sound like? It's going to sound like Paul McCartney, right?
Yeah.
Now, if Tony Iommi works with Paul McCartney, it's going to balance it out, right?
Yeah, it's going to have something of both.
Tony's not getting lost by Paul McCartney.
No.
And Tony Iommi isn't getting lost with Glenn Hughes. So, that's what happens when Glenn works with people who are of his stature or better. He tends to get balanced out, and you get the best of what he brings without him taking over, really.
Okay. Favorite songs of that album?
Gone is really good. It's funny, there's a song on the new Dead Daisies album that rips off the riff in Gone. Yeah, it's funny, and it's just like, I guess Glenn thought, he was enough a part of that he could recycle the riff. And, a lot of people have recycled riffs before, including Ritchie Blackmore. So, From Another World is really good. Don't You Tell Me is good. I'm Not the Same Man is good. This is all good stuff. It's all really good, and it's not Sabbath. It's IOMMI and Glenn Hughes. It's a completely different vibe. It has nothing like the dark vibe of Sabbath, and it certainly has nothing of the dark vibe of like Born Again. It's got a different vibe. Glenn Hughes isn't going to give you that darkness and that evil vibe. He doesn't write songs like Ronnie Dio writes about, like, Dungeons and Dragons and stuff like that. And he writes about human condition things. And so it's a completely different vibe, but it's still IOMMI giving you the riffs.
You don't know. Am I a sacrifice? Am I a fool to blind to see. I'm not a vagabond. I know what isn't meant to be.
These heavy, crushing riffs, and you're still getting a brilliant vocalist who's also a really good bass player. And so it's got a little bit of funkiness to it, but not in a way that you would, you know, necessarily, you know, feel as a departure. You know, it's not funkadelic. Let's put it that way.